We good? All right. Good afternoon, all. Good afternoon. It's so good to see you and your juicy faces. I am Reverend Kim Kendrick. I proudly serve as co-pastor alongside our other co-pastor, Vladimir Paeste. Here at Community Congregational Church, we welcome you, and we have a saying that goes, no matter who you are or where you are on life's journey, you are welcome here. So we want to welcome all of you this afternoon to our wonderful event that we have, our lecture series, where I believe that this is such a timely and important topic that we discuss right now with all that's going on in our world, all that's going on. So even before the flames, there were still fires that were igniting other things happening in our world. So this is timely, this is informative, and so important, because I know personally that this specific topic, this subject, not only transforms and shifts lives, it saves lives as well. So I want to make sure that I say welcome, welcome, welcome to Community Congregational Church. In case you have not found a place to put or park or question your faith, please feel free to join us on every given Sunday at 10 a.m. Also check out our website, cccucc.org, so that whether you're watching us recording online or you're watching us right here live in person, you have an opportunity to be a part of us. We've got a wonderful speaker that's not only a friend and a sibling, but a phenomenal, phenomenal speaker that's with us today. And I believe, Deborah Shanks, you're going to introduce... Oh, I'm sorry.
Hi, everyone. Just a few housekeeping notes. The restrooms are walk out this door here to your right. And today we're having Reverend Will McGarvey. He was the pastor of the UCC Presbyterian Church for 20 years in Pittsburgh, and for the past year he has been the executive director of the Solana Pride Center. So we're very excited to have him here in part 2 of our series on, and this topic today is weaponizing Christianity against the LGBTQ plus community. Also, if you have gotten a card when you came in or have not, please pick one up, because I'll just put a little plug in for our third lecture in this series on March 9th, will be Survival and Success in a Hostile Environment by the Reverend Casey Tinnan of Loomis Church. And that was the church that had the drag show, I believe, and they ran into a lot of problems with the Proud Boys and stuff. So if you haven't heard of the Loomis Church, they went through quite the time, and I've heard him talk on this event. It's very, very interesting, worthwhile coming for that one too. So at this point in time, I'd like to turn the mic over to Will, and thank you so much for coming.
Thank you. Can everybody hear me okay? Is that coming through all right? Yeah. Great. So I served for 20 years at Community Presbyterian, or East County Shared Ministry, over in Pittsburgh, Presbyterian and UCC Church since 1971, duly aligned. Also served on the board of the Rainbow Community Center in Concord, a coalition of welcoming congregations at PSR, Pacific School of Religions, as a part of the Center for Lesbian and Gay and Gender Studies there at PSR. And I was on the national board of More Light Presbyterians that brought about ordination and marriage equality in the Presbyterian Church USA. And for the last year, I've been serving as executive director of the Solano Pride Center in Fairfield, but we do our work all over the county. We do a lot of cultural competency trainings for counselors and teachers, businesses. If your organization needs to learn more, even more about the terminology, there's terminology sheets back here that we hope that you picked up on your way in. There's even a few books you're welcome to take a look through on Two-Spirit people and others there. I also have a biblical self-defense class that I teach a bit, and I'm doing that next week. I'm preaching for the Reconciling in Christ service at St. Mark's Lutheran in Fairfield, and sharing part 2 of the biblical self-defense course there. We also have an addressing religious trauma workshop that I'll talk about as well. So I'm going to run through some of the information that's on this sheet, and I don't know if that's me or if that's somebody else. It's my cheek here, maybe? Is that okay? Can you still hear me okay? Great. So When I was doing work in Contra Costa County, the acronym that they would use was LGBTQQI2S. And that was like the county's alphabet soup. And so when we use this terminology of LGBTQIA2S+, I mean the whole alphabet family. And we'll go through a little bit of what we mean with that, just so that everybody can be on the same page, because we may refer to this more later. So when we use the acronym SOGI to include sexual orientation, gender identity, gender expression. And this is the gift of the LGBTQI2S community to the straight and cis world, is that we've been thinking about a lot of these differences in ourselves, and we've developed a vocabulary about it. And it's a vocabulary that keeps changing, because when we talk about sexual orientation, that's whom you're physically or emotionally attracted to, who you have sex with, how you identify your sexuality. But when we talk about gender identity, that's really about what our internal sense tells us our gender is. And when we talk about sex, then we're talking about parts. The sex we were assigned at birth, referring to the presence of a specific anatomy, also might be referred to as assigned sex at birth, or assigned female at birth, or assigned male at birth. A lot of trans folks will use language like that, or even assigned intersex at birth. 1 in 1,000 people born are born intersex that we know of, but 1 in about 2,000 are born trans. But we don't often know more about them until later. So when we talk about sexual identity, terms like heterosexual, lesbian, gay, bisexual, that's how we use to convey our internal feelings of ourselves to others. But when we're talking about gender expression, it's how we present our gender to society through clothing, mannerisms, etc. And a lot of the things that our trans community have been teaching us, and especially our non-gender conforming community, is a reminder that we are fabulous. Everybody's fabulous. And that we're diverse. There's a diversity in the human family. And so when we talk about orientation terms, we hear a lot of terms like we're used to, LGB, lesbian, gay, bisexual, but there's been a lot of other terms that have been added to this, sometimes queer. Now for older folks, this was usually the one word that they heard right before the assault happened. So it's not a term that older folks have been reclaiming for themselves, but a lot of younger folks have been, as a way of trying to take the power away from that term. Q can also stand for questioning, intersex. Two-spirit is the Native American term that we'll learn a little bit more about. MSM is men who have sex with men is a term African American men will use for themselves because they don't want to be considered gay. And there is racism in every community, including the LGBTQ community. SGL, or same-gender loving, used in similar places for similar reasons. And as you can tell, the original pride flag had certain colors on it, and we've been adding different colors because as we learn more about ourselves and the diversity within our community, we want to be more inclusive rather than less. This is one of the few ones that actually shows a little medicine wheel there in the middle for a two-spirit. And it's inside of an asexual ring. So, but newer terms, including LGB+, would be pansexual, omnisexual, homoflexible, heteroflexible, graysexual, aromantic, polyamorous, asexual, demisexual. And even if you're looking at the differences between bisexual and pan and omni inside your descriptions here, you'll notice how close the definitions are. Some people, like I identified as a bisexual man for a while. Now I identify as an every gender loving person because I didn't want to play into the gender binary, this aspect with which we're socialized. It said, say you can either be a boy or a girl and you can't be anything either. So people will sometimes use additional language besides what's here. But play with that, and these are the latest ones. This is the 5th version in 1 year. In my 1 year working at Solano Pride Center, this is the 5th version of it. Okay? So, and it's important to recognize that there's a sexual orientation list with all of the ones that we've talked about, but there's also a gender identity list that includes transgender, cisgender, genderqueer, gender fluid, non-binary, which sometimes gets used by its acronym NB, pangender, agender, queer questioning, also two-spirit as a part of a gender identity, and we'll learn a little bit more about that here in a second, but I just want you to recognize that transgender is not a slur and cisgender is not a slur. It's a prefix that means same. Cis just means same. So there's a lot of Latin and there's a lot of Greek prefixes that get used in a lot of this. But this is how we're playing with language to describe the diversity that we experience within our own community. Let's learn a little bit about two-spirit folks now.
Lesbian, gay, bisexual, transgender, queer, gender nonconforming, and two-spirit. You probably haven't heard the last one, right? Well, two-spirit is a Native American term used to describe people who are believed to be blessed with both male and female spirits. And while the word itself is relatively new, two-spirit people have actually been around for centuries. So let us explain. For the hundreds of tribes who lived in what is now known as the United States, two-spirit people were individuals who took on both traditional female and male roles. For example, a two-spirit man might be both a weaver and a hunter, or a two-spirit woman might excel at crafting and combat. The tribe celebrated them not because of their gender identity, but for their range of skills. They were respected as healers, seers, and medicine people. They were considered lucky in finding love, and they could help others by matchmaking and creating love potions. Two-spirit people were often referred to in a third or fourth gender, but each tribe had their own interpretation and word for it. And while being two-spirit was more about the natural fluidity of gender roles than about sexual orientation, they did tend to have same-sex relationships. Two-spirit people were honored within their communities. They were celebrated, embraced, normalized. But ignorant European settlers not only treated them poorly, but they were also perplexed by their same-sex relationships. And not surprisingly, over time, American missionaries and government agents did all they could to stamp out these cultural practices among natives. They forced relocation and forced mandatory boarding schools to culturally assimilate into white society and required Christian conversion. So as you can imagine, two-spirit traditions began to fall by the wayside. Luckily, a small number of people were able to preserve them. Native American activists in the 1960s unearthed this tradition. And slowly, knowledge about indigenous gender nonconforming people began to spread. So in the late 1980s, Native American activists began referring to queer members of their community with a new term, two-spirit. Because it was in English, the term united hundreds of Native tribes and communities under a language and culture they all knew and shared. And like other modern terms like LGBTQ, the term two-spirit emphasizes spiritual and historical heritage as opposed to the sexual and biological aspects of gender identity. Although two-spirit is in English, its origins are rooted in indigenous language. The term became official at the 1990 Intertribal Native American Conference in Winnipeg, Manitoba. Today, while two-spirit people continue to deal with the effects of colonizers' attempts to wipe out Native culture, the term is being used by the indigenous queer community to help them claim not just their gender identity, but their ethnic and spiritual heritage too. Every time you hear about the need to break away from the binary, every time you hear the need to fight for gender fluidity, do remember that it's a term that is not a new fight. It's actually a return to our roots.
And sadly, even though before marriage equality occurred, even in the Cherokee Nation, there were so many Christians in the leadership of the Cherokee Nation that they didn't allow folks to get married on their actual nation. And it took them 3 or 4 years to reclaim what it meant in Cherokee. I think they have 3 or 4 genders. Lakota has 3, Dene have 4. And so sometimes even the nations themselves have had to reclaim parts of their own history in order to be able to really live into what does it mean to be two-spirit. And you'll notice that we like flags because we love colors. And everybody needs a flag, right? So you'll notice there's lots of different kinds of flags, some for different sexual orientation, some even historically when you're looking at the rainbow original in 1978 with a pink one on it. They added one without a pink stripe. They added black and brown for people of color and then did the progress flag starting in 2017. But here's the biggest gift that I think we give the world is helping to make this distinction between gender or between sexual identity or orientation and gender identity and expression. So even though we have sexual orientation on that one list before, here even breaking it out and understanding the difference between the way we identify, mostly internally, right, in our hearts and in our heads, how do we identify based on gender, is separate how we express that gender, right? And the more we understand a little bit about this, we even recognize that there's these 5 aspects rather than just maybe one aspect. Now, how many of you have heard of a gender reveal before? And sadly, a gender reveal is mostly about sex assigned at birth, right? It's either pink or blue. Very rarely is someone celebrated as purple in between, although there are genetic counselors that sometimes will help families know if there's something going on with the gender genetically of a child. They'll sometimes do a test and they'll know the actual gender. And we know that there's the diversity between XX for women and XY for men, and that there is 1 in 2,000 people that are born somewhat in between. And sometimes it occurs in 31 different clusters of genetic identities, but even then, we can't tell. Some people that have XY genome present as male because they had testosterone either in utero or in adolescence. Or they can also present as female, depending on what kind of hormones that they had in utero or during adolescence. And sometimes when those signals in a person's body gets crossed, they might have been born with female genitalia below or male genitalia below, but develop breast buds in adolescence because of the genetics, but also the whatever hormones that their body's producing. So we know that gender identity, gender expression, even who we're attracted to and emotionally attracted to are very diverse. And there are 5 different aspects of what makes us a person as a sexual being. And remember that cis isn't a slur, even because people are using trans as a slur. Sometimes, it's a way of not saying normal, because being trans is as normal as being cis is. It's just less common, right? So if our sexual orientation is on a spectrum, and it's easy for us to understand folks that are between homosexual and heterosexual and bisexual and everything else in between, that's also true for our gender identity and even for our gender expression. So, where did all these queer kids come from? How many people have heard that phrase recently? Especially during COVID, there were a lot of Gen Z kids that did come out to be a part of the queer community. For folks that weren't paying attention to that human diversity, it may have seen that all of a sudden people are talking about being queer, and maybe it's just fashionable, rather than recognizing that for centuries, the queer experience has been erased from mainstream history, and that there is evidence of non-traditional sexuality and gender roles and presentations as far back as ancient times. And I'm going to just roll through a lot of different cultures here, because a lot of different cultures express it in different ways, and it might be helpful for us to just recognize how broadly these different expressions are in different cultures, because it might help us understand why Christianity itself, especially conservative Christianity, has chosen to target us. So when we look at India, both in the art and in the writings, we know that there were same-gender loving relationships with folks. We can see it especially in a lot of the art, even in sexual positions. We can tell that different parts of India tended to be more traditional or patriarchal. Other times, this tended to be allowed a little bit more. King Bhagirati was born out of copulation between 2 women. It's one of the stories. There's some other folks that are telling some of the stories from ancient India as reclaiming these relationships, especially pre-colonial, pre-British colonialism, and we'll talk a little bit about how that's contributed to where we are today. But even their deities show gender diversity and even differing bodily forms with multiple arms, expressions of different abilities, right? But even some deities having 2 genders at the same time. There are 19 Hindu deities in that way. Greece, of course, we've probably read a lot about Lesbos or Sapphic relations. We can see it in the pottery. We know that it's definitely a part of even the military culture where older men would take younger men or paidions as their lovers, but also training them into what it meant to be adult. Lots of different stories make it to us today, including the ones from Sappho, and express the full human diversity that we experience today pretty much there. Egypt, some of it has been covered up because of the access of an Arabic government there doesn't want to point, well, sometimes the Arabic government there doesn't want to even admit how many people were actually African as a part of ancient Kemet in Egypt, or that there were same-gender loving relationships going on in whatever form, some of it that we can read about, less of it that we have access to today. And part of that might be the British occupation and the British stealing of things, especially archaeological aspects. There was a time when bisexuality was the norm in a Han dynasty in China. During the Qing dynasty, poets produced texts about homosexuality in the 18th century, promoted women's emancipation, and suggested a homosexual marriage contract. Even in a very patriarchal culture like China, where there were 5 different philosophies of life, we now only know of 2 of them, the Tao and Confucianism. Confucianism is very patriarchal. We don't know much about the other 3 because they're not practiced as much today. But there was Sapphic relations in that patriarchal culture, and there are stories and art that continue to be able to be found into the folklore. And even heterosexual polygamy emerges as a common theme. So, you know, it shows up in different ways in different cultures. Ancient Scythia, I just learned this a couple days ago. There were a priesthood of fierce-fighting eunuch shamans that were trans women who called Inari, and this was a part of their spiritual leadership. A lot of bisexual people in the past were made shaman or medicine people. And so sometimes queer people were seen as sacred and put into spiritual leadership positions, gay, lesbian as well. So this is something from the Black Sea area. But ancient Rome did tend to have, you know, a lot of the same types of cultures that we saw in Greece. Also pederasty with the training of younger boys, but also male and female same-gender relations and polyamory as well in different forms, ancient Rome. How many of you have heard of eunuchs? Okay, eunuchs are an interesting group of people in the ancient world. This stone tablet from 595 BCE names Sarsekim as the chief eunuch of King Nebuchadnezzar in Babylon. And it has some interaction with the Bible, because when the Jewish elites were taken into exile to Babylon, the people that actually were taken from Jerusalem were the folks who could read and write. So they were the elites that were able to work as administrators within the kingdom. Many of them were made into eunuchs in order to serve the emperor without the emperor being at risk of you putting your child onto his throne. So most administrators in these ancient empires were made eunuchs. And so this was one of the costs of being able to read and write and being able to work in that world, was not being able to put your own child onto the throne, because the emperor wanted to make sure that their child made it onto the throne, right? So because there were portions of the Jewish law that said a person whose testes does not fall or a person who's not whole cannot be made a priest. There's portions of Deuteronomy and Leviticus that talk about this. When these priests, and they were mostly priests who were became the folks working as eunuchs in Babylon, when they came back, the big crisis of faith was, well, according to the laws, I can no longer, I'm not physically whole. I can't be a priest anymore. And so there's this minority report added to the Bible to say, that yes, they should be brought in, but as Rabbi Elliot Kukla says, the rabbis of the Mishnah who lived in the first 2 centuries of the Common Era identify at least 4 possible genders or sexes: the Zakar male, the Nekava female, as well as 2 sexes that are neither male nor female called the Tumtum and Androgynos. They also had 2 other categories for gender identity that don't appear at birth but develop later in life, especially after adolescence. The Saras is born male but later develops female traits, and the Eloned is born female but later develop male traits. Did you know that Abraham and Sarah are both Tumtum? We can't understand that story without understanding that they were infertile and therefore Tumtum, of a different gender. This portion from the Talmud: all are obligated to read the scrolls of Esther on Purim. Priests, Levites, converts, freed slaves, disqualified priests, mamzarim, a born saras, a saras by human action, that would be a eunuch. Those with damaged testicles, those lacking testicles, all of them are obligated. A tumtum and an androgynos are obligated. Women, slaves, and minors are exempt. So the Talmud is what Jews use to interpret their Bible or the Torah itself. So the religious obligations don't leave just because someone's a gender minority. Their religious duties are still there, even like everyone is obligated to read the scroll on Purim. Also from Mishnah Bikurim. And androgynos is in some respects legally equivalent to men, and in some respects legally equivalent to women. In some respects legally equivalent to men and women, and in some respects legally equivalent to neither men nor women. So a lot of the work of these rabbis was trying to figure out what their law in the Talmud, in the Torah said, and the Talmud is their commentary, like a law commentary about which portion applies to who, right? And they're saying that it's different based on each of these gender identities, and that they're recognizing that there are these 6 different gender identities within Judaism. Now, not every Jewish rabbi is out there teaching this. A lot of the more Hasidic or modern Orthodox might start talking about this a little bit, but most of the Orthodox that don't want to include the LGBTQ community just ignore these portions of the Talmud. The Reform and the Reconstructionists and even the conservative folks are recognizing that this is a part of their history and teaching more folks in the Jewish community that there are these different distinctions of different gender identities and expressions within their own work. And we had Ariel Vagosin from Gender Illumination came out last October and did a whole workshop with us about what the Talmud says and doesn't say, and what that means for us as people of faith, whatever tradition that you may happen to be for today. So we try to host some things like this with folks from different faith traditions. So when we're thinking about Isaiah 56, this is that minority report I was telling you about. Now think, if you're one of these priests that was taken into exile into Babylon, and you know, because you're a priest, that you're not really supposed to be included once the Babylonians did the excising of your testicles, because you're no longer completely whole anymore, what would this mean to you to hear this story? Thus says the Lord, maintain justice and do what is right, for soon my salvation will come and my deliverance will be revealed. And this is a part of the prophecy post-exile, coming back from Babylon. Happy is the mortal who does this, the one who holds it fast, who keeps the Sabbath, not profaning it, and refrains from doing any evil. Do not let the foreigner join to the Lord say, the Lord will surely separate me from his people. And do not let the eunuch say, I am just a dry tree. For thus says the Lord to the eunuchs who keep my Sabbaths, who choose the things that please me and hold fast my covenant, I will give in my house and within my walls a monument and a name better than sons and daughters. I will give them an everlasting name that shall not be cut off, and the foreigners who join themselves to the Lord to minister to him, to love the name of the Lord and to be his servants, all who keep the Sabbath and do not profane it and hold fast my covenant, these I will bring to my holy mountain and make them joyful in my house of prayer. Their burnt offerings and their sacrifices will be accepted on my altar, for my house shall be called a house of prayer for all peoples. So the Bible is not a monolith that says the same thing against everybody, or, once, becoming a eunuch happens to you, there's no chance for you. It's a mixed bag. And there are minority reports like this that would have said that such a priest returning from Babylon should be included in the society, and that their learning needed to be used to be able to really reteach everyone the laws again as they were re-covenanting what that meant. And when we look into the Christian scriptures, we're taught a little bit more about eunuchs, that men who are unable to procreate or penetrate. In Matthew 19, Jesus says there's three kinds of eunuchs: from birth, at the hands of men, and those, he actually elevates the ones who are made eunuchs by choice. Elevates that up as if that should be the way, the most coveted way. We don't teach that often in church. Thank you, Jesus. There is another eunuch in Acts 8 on the story of the Ethiopian eunuch. And what's interesting, like the Isaiah text, is that this new basis for who gets included is kind of described there. Because here in this story, there's an Ethiopian eunuch who's reading the Isaiah scroll. He comes upon a part of it, and he can't quite interpret it. So he asks Stephen, one of the first deacons in the New Testament, about it, and Stephen teaches him about who Jesus was. He accepts Jesus. The eunuch looks over at the little water next to where they're walking and said, "What's keeping me from being baptized?" Stephen said, "Nothing is keeping you from being baptized." Baptizes him on the spot. Kind of unheard of without a church council voting on it. But this sets up the new basis for inclusion. Anyone whom the Spirit falls on is included. Not just everyone who keeps the covenant. It's like the minority report from Isaiah 56. Clement of Alexandria, a church father, says a true eunuch is not one who's unable, but one who's unwilling to indulge in pleasure with a woman. And even conservative scholars say that this ancient term eunuch includes homosexual men and women, kind of an umbrella term from the past. So, even despite Deuteronomy 22, no woman may wear an article of man's clothing or any man put on a woman's dress, for those who do these things are abominable to the Lord your God. The eunuch gets baptized, and it brings up about this kind of division that we're having in our society these days, especially around bathrooms, right? And even in bathrooms in churches, one of the most dangerous places for trans people these days is around bathrooms, because we've allowed them to be these gender sequestered areas. And because we've let folks that want to say this is a male space and this is a female space say that, then what do our trans folks do, especially if they're really struggling with that? This is what that choice looks like to a lot of folks. If you go into the one that you actually present like, if people know that you're trans, you risk getting yelled at. Or if you are in the opposite one, you could get beat up. All to protect these sexual segregated zones that we should all feel comfortable in anyway, right? So, I don't know if you've heard of this, but the Acts of Paul and Thecla is one of these books that didn't make it to the Bible from the Apocrypha. And Thecla is this young woman who, her dad has basically betrothed her to marry this man, Thamyris, and she doesn't want to marry him. She hears Paul's preached. She's like, yeah, I really like this message. Paul praises her beauty and warns her that other men may seduce her. So she refuses, and she changes her gender appearance in order to be a preacher with Paul. She cross-dresses to escape this marriage that was planned by her father. But according to that Deuteronomy text, even someone who is not wearing the dress, the cultural dress that they were born into, shouldn't be accepted. And that's kind of where some of the biblical literalists will point to, that's, we're just trying to keep Deuteronomy 22 without recognizing that there are these other minority reports and that the Bible itself isn't as ubiquitous or unified on that. What the Bible is pretty unified on is that polygamy is a sexual norm. We don't talk about that much in church either, do we? Even in the New Testament. This might be why Mary and the other Marys are at the foot of Jesus at his crucifixion, because they're the sister wives of Joseph. They're supporting their sister wife. There is still polygamy, polygyny, multiple wives, practiced by some Muslims and Jewish and Christians in the Middle East. It is a cultural norm of that region. It's practiced mostly underground, except for the Muslims. It's a part of the Muslim tradition. If you can afford it, you can afford to have up to 4 wives in Islam. But when we look at the Bible and what does marriage look like, it looks like patriarchal polygamy or polygyny, multiple wives. Matriarchal polygamy is called polyandry, with multiple husbands. And there are places that allow that, just a few, including Kenya, India, especially in this northern state of Jaunzar region and some parts of the Kinnour and Himachal. China has some places, Chad, mainly among Christians there, and this Irrigawe tribe. Don't you love that cartoon? You mean none of you took the trash out? Why, you rarely see a female polygamist. Gender roles are also socialized, right? We could socialize all of us to do the dishes if we chose to. So in the Bible, there's at least 8 types of marriage in the Hebrew Bible, and let's just go through them really quickly. There's a man and a woman in a nuclear family. Genesis 2:24. Now this is Adam and Eve, not Adam and Lilith, who's the first. The rabbis talked about Adam's first wife. How many of you heard of Adam's first wife? Yeah, a few. This is all from the Talmud, but it's how the rabbis tried to figure out, well, what happened to that first wife that he was married to before they were back into this new paradise, and then Eve is, because at the end of the first creation narrative, it talks about a man and a woman being created together as equals. By the time we see Eve come, she's being created out of this rib or out of the side of Adam, and women are being described as secondary creatures in that story. So the rabbis saw through this, especially in the Hebrew, and recognized that Adam had a first wife who would not submit to being on the bottom and allowing Adam to be on top because she was equal. Look it up. It's a great story. So a man and a woman, nuclear family, a man and wives plus concubines. And this is what we see for Abraham, Gideon, Nahor, Jacob, a lot of the founding fathers of Judaism. A man and a woman's property. Hagar, think Hagar. Sarah's helpmate or servant. She gets offered as a secondary wife. Man, woman plus woman, polygyny. Lamech, so multiple wives. A man and a brother's widow. When my little brother died in 2007, if this law was still going, I would have had to have married my sister-in-law, take her into my home, and have children with her in my brother's name. That's what a biblical literalist would do. We don't hear many folks talking about that being actually happened. A rapist and his victim, there are stories of that in Deuteronomy 22. A male soldier and a prisoner of war, Numbers 31 and Deuteronomy 21. And a male slave and a female slave with the permission often of their owners, sadly, because slavery was the norm of the ancient world, even in the Christian scripture time. Fortunately, we've had some really good conversations about love and marriage. And the whole conversation leading up to the legalization of marriage for same-gender loving couples, I think, helped us get there and recognize that Jesus really never said anything about that. And that he never performed marriages. He never claimed to be a rabbi. And by the time that term becomes an office, 100 years after Jesus, with the rise of rabbinic Judaism, We don't know who performed weddings in this time, or we wouldn't know from the Bible. We might know from archaeology, but it doesn't say Jesus performed any weddings. We just don't know. But a lot of what Christians talk about and the picture that they have for Christian marriage is one man and one woman being solemnized by the church. And yet we don't talk about how in the 12s and 1300s and 1400s there were same-sex rights in monasteries in parts of Europe. John Boswell came up with this a few years ago and actually found some of these liturgies that people were marrying, mostly people inside the monasteries that would marry each other for life and be partners. We can't tell how sexual they were, but even when we look back further in history, we can see the story of Sergio and Bacchus, 4th century Roman lovers and martyrs. They were members of the military that, when they converted, became pacifists, and then were martyred when they wouldn't go to war. And there's a cathedral in Egypt that is named after them, and these little rings around their necks are wedding bands in their culture. Perpetua and Felicity, patron saints of same-sex couples, early Christian martyrs, friends to the end, even with the lions and the persecution against early Christians. These are two women that supported each other even to that bitter end. That even stories like the centurion and his pice, how many have heard this story before? There's a slight differences even between the versions in the different gospels that are interesting, and we'll take a look at those. So the story happens in Matthew 8, Luke 7, and John 4, and this centurion, an army officer in charge of overseeing 100 soldiers, had a pice, a young boy, a son, youthful-looking boy, child, slave, physically fit male serving in the Roman army. And the question is, who is this pice you keep talking about? He basically comes to Jesus, and because he's a man in the militaries, he basically says, Jesus, I understand. I'm a man that works under authority. If you say it, that my pice, my son or my servant or my cutie pie will be saved, I trust that the healing will occur. Jesus says, I have not found so much faith in anyone, even in the house of Israel, but he commends this centurion for having such faith in him. The centurion's boyfriend and the Aramenos. So in some translations, we know from other Greek writers like Plato, Thucydides, and Aeschines, they all use this term pice for a cutie pie. In Matthew, it's pice. By the time Luke gets written later, he's a doulos, or a slave. By the time John's gospel gets written, this same story is turning him into a son. So we can tell that there's some folks that understand what's really going on in this relationship. But in Matthew, the centurion says, only speak the word and my pice will be healed, and Jesus trusts him, heals him from afar. But this is also this era during the Roman Empire, especially with the rise of Julius, or with Caesar Augustus, who's well known for being the first emperor of Rome, but even more for being a self-proclaimed restorer of the republic. He believed in these ancestral values such as monogamy, chastity, piety, or virtue, and he introduced a number of moral and political reforms in order to improve Roman society and formulate a new Roman government and lifestyle. And the basis of each of these reforms was to revive traditional Roman religion in the state, so it was very much connected. Remember, there's no separation of church and state in these ancient world, right? You give your taxes through your donations at the temple of Apollo and Diana, as well as your support of the polis, or the city, in doing so. So this might be where we start to see Roman culture moving away from the lasciviousness that we kind of hear about in this era, more towards this virtue. But this might be what has been being picked up on over the years with outer recognition that these Romans oftentimes did experience polygamy or polygyny, multiple wives, because it was still a very patriarchal world. And the man, as the head of the household, have you heard that before? That's where the word economia comes from. Economy is this, this pater familias that oversees his household as a way of, even you know, Homer's Odyssey has a lot of these ideas in it as well. But I think a lot of these ideas get picked up by the British Empire. And this is interesting. This comes from an article in 2018 from CNN that says of the 71 countries around the world in which same-sex sexual relations are illegal, it's no coincidence that more than half of them are former British colonies or protectorates. According to research provided by the International LGBTI Association, in most of these countries, legislation outlawing consensual gay sex was inherited from British rule and left in place following independence. Speaking at a Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting in April 17, 2018, British Prime Minister Theresa May expressed regret at the British Empire's long legacy of homophobic legislation. She said, "I'm all too aware that these laws were often put in place by my own country. They were wrong then and they are wrong now," she told the gathered leaders. "As the UK's Prime Minister, I deeply regret both the fact that such laws were introduced and the legacy of discrimination, violence, and even death that persists today." And we see this legacy in a lot of the English-speaking world because we borrowed a lot of this from the British Empire. Just like we've borrowed and kind of taken over the British Empire, and including all of its costs with all these wars all over the world, since they've kind of given that over to us. But we can see that there's this kind of history of colonialism and homosexuality, especially the fascism of trying to control men and encouraging a manly man to be able to be a part of this colonizing culture. And we see it in Russian world. We saw it, even the difference between pre-colonial history of homosexuality in India. But when we think of the Buggery Act in 1533, and even King James, that the King James Bible was named after, who was a flaming homosexual, he was very, very out. And it probably cost him quite a bit in his own administration. It might be the reason why he paid for the translation of the King James Bible, was to try to earn some points back with the religious groups who hated his homosexuality. But whether it was in reaction to King James and his effeminate nature and all the boyfriends that he had on a regular basis, or something else that held over from the Roman Empire and this idea of what they're socializing young men into, to being a warrior class, right? But not having a relationship with your cutie pie on the side when you're out on the front, or without recognizing that part of the conversation. That probably still happened too. But there is something about the British, and in some ways, sadly, American colonization has kind of taken up this role where pastors like Scott Lively are basically the ones taking this very missionary-oriented, homophobic form of Christianity, remissionizing places like Uganda and other parts of Africa. He's actually been brought up on charges of human rights abuses for teaching his particular theology in Africa as a form of colonization. And he's just an American evangelical pastor who decided that that was what his calling should be. I think he's Southern Baptist. But there are still places in the world where you can be punished for being queer. And as you can see, some of that's with the patriarchy of the Russian state and the Russian Orthodox Church that's kind of taken on some of those same positions in very similar ways. But even a lot of the former British colonies in South America, it doesn't show as much with Australia, but there's portions of it that are there as well. And these are the places that you can, that have laws against your orientation if you're not straight. And you can be arrested for being gay, lesbian, bi, or others. So the way that we experience this a lot these days is in the conversations around Christian nationalism. And Christian nationalism is a form of nationalist Christianity that has looked more and more fascistic. You know what I mean with that? More and more like fascism. And trying to say, well, some of these pastors have been teaching a revisionist history for at least 50 or 60 years, especially D. James Kennedy in the little fundamentalist Presbyterian group in Florida, and others have been trying to teach that America was always a Christian nation, not a nation made up of Christians. And do you get the distinction there? By trying to say that America is a Christian nation, it means that their values should be the ones that always have sway, whether they're in the majority or not. But if it's a nation where you're free to be Christian or Jewish or Muslim or nothing, and I would argue that you cannot have religious freedom without the freedom to be nothing as well as something, that we need to be able to recognize this, especially because it's taken a dark turn over the last few years. Steve Bannon. Christian nationalism, Gordon Martinez from Texas points out that Christian nationalism is a perversion of the gospel of Jesus Christ. Instead of emulating Jesus and acting as prophetic voices for love and truth, false prophets like Steve Bannon act as priests of the empire. It's connected to the way that they view the world and their right to be able to make you believe what they want you to believe, or their right to demand that you're a part of their political movement, right? And so it didn't start just with Billy Graham or Joel Osteen's megachurch. This started in the first and second Great Awakenings. Do you know how many people were Christian in the United States in 1776 when our country began? No more than 20%. And it was during that time with the first Great Awakening, especially in Congregationalist and Presbyterian circles, there was a lot of religious fervor. King George actually called our Revolutionary War a Presbyterian rebellion because it was being preached in Presbyterian pulpits. That we needed to separate ourselves from England in order to be truly free. Does that make sense? By the time you come to the 1830s and the Second Great Awakening, you have a whole lot of other new movements that's not just about making Jesus your choice and you'll drive a Rolls Royce, but that's kind of where the theology goes eventually, right, with the prosperity gospel. Here, you have a whole lot of folks that are saying, boy, the world's really changing. We had a couple of these summers in the 1830s, and it was snowing in Pennsylvania. There was a volcano in northwest of Japan that went off in 1831, and it kept a very cold summer that year. But people automatically thought, well, Jesus must be coming back, because now the dates and the seasons are changing. Maybe Jesus and the second coming is going to come back. So you had all of these Mormons and Oneidas and Jehovah's Witnesses and Christian Science, and a lot of the Second Great Awakening groups were millenarian. They thought Jesus was coming, so look busy. And you better prepare for this 1,000-year reign of Christ or whatever. So a lot of them expected Jesus to come back any minute. Many of them thought that Jesus was going to come back by 1904 because that was the end of some generation or way of counting generations in their time. But now, all of those groups have kind of come and they've gone through their missed opportunity. Jesus didn't come on the clouds like they said. So they've kind of created themselves as denominations and have their own unique theologies and different things like that. We have this history in the United States of the religious community always getting us worked up, thinking that this revival is coming for some reason or some cosmic reason. And then when it doesn't happen, then people kind of go back to being whatever they were and maybe kicking themselves for being fooled once or twice. like, oh my gosh, did we do that again? But it's interesting here. Steve Dundas, retired U.S. Navy chaplain, Virginia Faithful America member, says, "We are actively witnessing the demise of the Establishment Clause and protected liberties of all of the hands of Christian nationalism. We must vehemently reject all rhetoric that threatens American freedoms now, including the inaccurate interpretation of the gospel fueling Christian nationalism and the Reawaken America tour that General what's his name? The general who's been on the talk circuit. Flynn, yes, fascist Flynn. He was doing bus tours, trying to get people, and doing revivals, trying to get people all excited that if we just get our act together, maybe this time Jesus will come. Yeah. Rather than recognizing maybe we need to rethink that theology. Barry Goldwater said, "Mark my word, if and when these preachers get control of the Republican Party, and they're sure trying to do so, it's going to be a terrible damn problem. Frankly, these people frighten me. Politics and governing demand compromise, but these Christians believe they're acting in the name of God, so they won't compromise. I know, I've tried to deal with them." That's Barry Goldwater. Faithful America points out Christian nationalist leaders like Mike Flynn, Jug Mastriano, Clay Clark don't want you to know what their biggest critics are actually Christians too. The bottom line, don't listen to them, listen to Jesus and love your neighbor. Be a nice person. Like that's radical, right? You were a believer, yes, but you skipped the not being a jerk about it part. This is kind of the world that a lot of us Christians are living in these days, where it's hard to watch what's being said in the name of Christ, and I'm afraid if we don't learn how to use our voice better, people are going to keep thinking that that's the actual message of Jesus, right? Now, we know from the Two-Spirit video earlier that folks are reclaiming what it means to be Two-Spirit. And when we think of the history of this continent, and even pastors like the guy who was at Saddleback Church and wrote the Purpose-Driven Life, Rick Warren, said that for 10,000 years, all we had on this continent was, one male and one female in marriage forever. And he basically said anything else but that is revisionist history. But when you hear Pretty Shield, who died in 1944, a medicine woman from the Crow Nation, she says, Christian leaders stand on our soil and claim gay marriage has never occurred here. Over 130 tribes in every region of North America performed millions of same-sex marriages for hundreds of years. Their statements are both hateful and ignorant. Your homosexual was our Two-Spirit people, and we considered them sacred. This has implications even for the conversation we'd like to have around immigration, because some of the laws have been changed to make it harder for folks to be able to use marriage as the way to get their own spouse to be able to automatically join into an immigration process that gets them citizenship too. And especially since marriage equality happened in 2015, a lot of this has been a target of the religious right quite a bit as well. So sometimes we have to head to the streets. Sometimes you have to put on a collar and remind folks that all of our rights are there for all of us, and that we all get them equally, or none of us should be able to count it separately. Andrew Whitehead, who wrote this in American Idolatry, How Christian Nationalism Betrays the Gospel and Threatens the Church, said, when it comes down to democracy or power, white Christian nationalism will choose power every time. It really is a power movement. It's not really a religious movement, and really none of their religious rationales offer much, especially in the way of compassion or the teachings of Jesus. And a lot of their teachings are perpetuating white supremacy as well. White Jesus whitewashes the brown Jesus. Whiteness is directly associated with the divine, creates a false reality and a false Christianity. White characteristics are made superior. Physique and perfection of body are equated with divinity. Hypermasculinity is centralized. Limits how we see and experience God. It's interesting watching a lot of these young evangelicals that are becoming the influencers on YouTube, growing big, deep beards, as if that's what makes them masculine. Have you noticed that? Is it just me? Now, we rarely get the Westboro Baptist hate group. They're not really a church, they're a hate group that coming to the Bay Area, but they did make it about 5 or 6 years ago. They protested at a couple friends of my friends' churches in Walnut Creek. And The Unitarian Universalists had angel wings to protect the folks that were in their parking lot so they wouldn't have to see the ugliness. But I don't know why they went to the Christian Science folks down the street. I don't know why they went to the Jewish congregation across the street either, because they had nothing to do with Jesus. They went to a Catholic church, St. Mary's over there in Walnut Creek too, in order to kind of share this you're going to hell kind of theology, and they're a fascinating group. Most of them belong to like one extended family, and all they do is go around the country and protest at different places. And if you don't believe with them exactly, you're going to hell. So there might be, so this is Westboro Baptist Church. There's hundreds of different kinds of Baptists out there. There are liberal Baptists, American Baptists, National Baptists. These are nothing like those as denominations, but it's so fascinating what passes for religion these days. And it's kind of connected up with this power thing in this way too. You've confused your war on religion with not always getting what you want. So our culture wars are also ways that people are trying to divide and conquer, but also, sadly, the gay community and the lesbian community were a wedge issue when Anita Bryant, who just died, targeted them in the 70s and 80s, and the trans community are just as much being used as a wedge issue today as our gay and lesbian community was being targeted in the 70s and 80s, and they're using some of the same exact rhetoric. They're not even changing the script, sadly. But, guys, I said I hate figs. Come on. Sometimes it takes some creative resistance to be able to help folks wake up. There are some folks, granddaughters of Fred Phelps, who started Westboro Baptist, that have left the cult. There are other groups like the Southern Baptist, the lady on the right, now I'm blanking on her name now, Amanda Tyler. She's with a group that actually does a lot of really good work against Christian nationalism from a Baptist place, from like a Southern Baptist place. And what's interesting is that Southern Baptist, as a denomination, never wanted to be a denomination. They wanted to have soul freedom. Soul freedom was Roger Williams' amazing spiritual insight that he shared with folks, that people should be able to believe what they want to believe without being told what to believe by the church. Soul freedom. And that each congregation gets to choose who they ordain as a pastor. And for years and years and years, the Southern Baptists were ordaining men and women, and they were okay with abortion until they saw it as a way that they could stop talking about segregation. Because a lot of their schools were segregated still. And when they saw the opportunity to shift their position on abortion, and the Southern Baptists supported abortion before, and within 3 years of Roe v. Wade, they took the opposite position, so they had another wedge issue to be able to try and divide and conquer us. So fortunately, we have some co-religionists that are doing good work and helping us recognize that it's easy to look at an image like this and think, oh, we're so outnumbered. There's only so many blue states. There's only so many purple states. But when we really look at it, even when we look by county, look how much greater diversity there is. Look at all the pink in that. There's not as much dark red in that as you would think, except maybe western Nebraska and Kansas, some of those places, right? And we know that the places where a lot of our queer families are thriving are in the South. Why did that happen? Because they kept getting born there, and they didn't want to have to leave their family, right? So when we look at all of this diversity, and even when we look at all the work we've done over the last 20 years, this was the ceremony where they recognized the original ordination of the 7 Lutheran pastors, including Megan Rohr, who was ordained as a bishop before they ousted them from that position here in our local Lutheran diocese. But they recognized the 7 irregularly listed ministers as fully included. And once they changed the policy at the national level, this was the celebration and reintroducing them to the full list in the Lutheran Church. We know Gene Robinson's been out there. Let's be clear, we've always had gay bishops. All I'm doing is being honest about it. And that really is the way I think we need to start talking about it, is we've always had these religious diversities, and we've always been in every closet as well as prayer confessional throughout the church. And even in some of our other theological progressiveness, we don't have to believe all the things that people have told us about other things as well. And this was the image I loved sharing with my congregation, that when you come in the door, this really is my expectation. You don't have to check your head at the door. You can take anything that I'm saying and do your own study, and if you find something different, come tell me. Let's talk about it. I want to know if you're finding something different than I am, because then we can sharpen each other's tools and be able to have better service in the world. But I think this is the kind of Christianity that we really need these days, and one that lives here. God is still speaking, right? That don't put a period where God might have put a comma. And what God might be speaking through you, I might need to hear. And your ability to be able to read it from your social location might help me pick out something in my social location that I might be missing. So maybe we actually need each other to be able to hear what God might be saying from the scriptures, from our experience, from what does it mean to be human, to be able to exist and survive, but also thrive. So Pride isn't just a month for us. It's more important because somewhere out there is a confused teenager who still thinks maybe being dead is better than being gay. And this is what we're looking at another 4 years of. And he's already coming for our trans community, and he already got the GOP to cut military kids that are trans out of the last funding bill. And our own Mike Thompson on the east part of our county signed off on that. Fortunately, Garamendi didn't. But we have even Democrats who say that they are for us, even came to our center and said, what can we do to support you? He still voted that way. And I don't know how we get where we need to be without recognizing that we've been here before. And that the Stonewall riots started because trans women got tired of police brutality and weren't going to put up with it anymore. And it was led by trans and gender nonconforming people. And yet most of the privileges in the LGBTQ community gather towards LGB and not so much the T. In fact, even Barney Frank, when he had a chance to stand up and say, no, we need to fund protections and make sure that the policy is there to protect all of us, said, okay, we'll do the stuff for the LGBT community now. We'll put the stuff for the trans community off for another few years, and threw them under the bus. And it was our own gay legislator who did it in the 90s, right? And this has happened over and over and over again as well, until there comes a time when people are standing up for themselves and they will not be treated differently, whether it's 1959 Los Angeles, whether it's 1962 Manhattan, and there were police raids and people were being arrested and their livelihood was being threatened with being outed. 1965 Philadelphia. 1966 San Francisco and Compton's cafeteria. And there was a riot here too. Sometimes, only once or twice, were Christian ministers arrested with the folks, trying to stand up for their rights. We needed to do a better job then. We need to do a better job now. How many of you have a trans friend or colleague who's actually admitted to you how fearful they are right now? It's feeling like this right now. And the leaders that were the first to pick up and protect other folks, like Tammy, still living in San Francisco, I think. Felicia Elizondo. Susan Stryker, who still does a lot of work with our Louise Lawrence Trans Archive here in Vallejo. Have any of you been to the Louise Lawrence Trans Archive? Oh, this is the gem of Vallejo. Did you know Vallejo was the Castro before the Castro was? Make Vallejo gay again. Yes. There was a history, especially with the military base, and some of the soldiers had places you could get a room with the lesbians or with the gay guys. But Cary Grant had a home, Liberace had a home. People that were working in San Francisco would take the ferry over here to party before everyone moved back to the Castro and made it the gentrified, gay male-centered place that it is, where lesbians can't even tend to find each other there anymore, it seems, right? Screaming Queens, Compton's Cafeteria. So, we hanging in there? If I go another 15 or 20 minutes, is that all right? Okay. So, what is our call as people of faith, the people of good conscience? How do we leverage our own faith traditions to be able to protect each other? First, you've got to know enough about your own tradition to know how to stand up for the folks in your own tradition. Then learn enough about another tradition to know how to do it from their theology. Read some of the books on Two-Spirit folks, like some of the books that are back here. There's also another book, and there's a movie called Two-Spirit of a young Dene man named Fred Martinez that's just a powerful story. Watch the videos, read the books, get to know the culture a little bit more. Marsha P. Johnson was one of the leaders at the Stonewall riot in New York. You never completely have your rights, one person, until you have all your rights. Bayard Rustin, a gay Quaker who planned the March on Washington with 3x5 cards and a telephone, wasn't allowed to speak because he was caught making out with his boyfriend in Pasadena a few weeks beforehand. But he was the one that organized the March on Washington. When an individual is protesting society's refusal to acknowledge his dignity as a human being, his very act of protest confers dignity on him. He said, "My activism did not spring from being black. The racial injustice that was present in this country during my youth was a challenge to my belief in the oneness of the human family." He's the one that taught Dr. King how to really put nonviolent strategy into work. Because when he, and there's a couple different documentaries about him. Brother Outsider's pretty good. There's a newer one too that points out that when Bayard first met Dr. King in person, there were guards with guns in his front yard to protect him from the firebomb threats. And he reminded him, as Gandhi said, you have to be a practitioner of nonviolence in all of your ways if you expect it to work. We may not live in a society anymore where nonviolence works anymore because the people that are in charge and in power no longer have shame that we can't shame them into doing the right thing anymore. It only works in certain places. James Baldwin says, love takes off the masks that we fear we cannot live without and know we cannot live within. Of course, 1 John 4, beloved, let us love one another because love is from God. Everyone who loves is born of God and knows God. We wholeheartedly affirm that transgender, non-binary, and gender-expansive individuals are beloved and cherished by God. And there are groups in almost every denomination, even Mormons and Catholics, trying to reform their church to be able to theologically accept the full humanity of all of their membership. And there's some great groups that are doing a lot of that work, and it's really fascinating to watch the Methodist Church, because they're a global church, take as long as they did because they had to have this fight on a global fight, also against some of their own bishops in Africa who still have that missionary theology of colonized Christianity that says they shouldn't accept their own gay and lesbian kids. But this is interconnected with some other stuff that's going on these days. And this is kind of what we hear from some of our elites, people who would consider themselves elites. Careful, mate, that foreigner wants your cookie. And what's he saying to the next guy? Hey, he is why you don't have your own cookie. Careful, that foreigner wants your cookie. But where are the cookies going? These fights are to divert our attention from them wanting to deport 20 million people, our neighbors, our friends and their kids, to separate families. Careful, mate, that foreigner wants your cookie. In some ways, these are the memes that we're getting from a lot of our oligarchs today, aren't they? And they're just pitting us against each other. Careful, those trans people are going to get too much power, then what are you going to do? Oh, I didn't think about it that way before. What if they get enough power to actually survive? Like that would be a bad thing. Come back to what is our religious impulse. It should be love, right? I think that's why marriage equality worked for folks, because they got that it was about love and family, and that's why it's going to be hard for them to rip that apart unless they have a very pernicious Supreme Court, maybe with 2 new people after the Thomas and Alito are replaced by Trump. But the other thing I think we need to do is we need to educate ourselves about the history of our own human family. And this is a great website to do that at. It's the PBS one. All of these links are in the back page of your handout, by the way. So if you didn't get a handout, there's some back there. And this PBS link is great because every one of these little blue points there are a different two-spirit group. There are different indigenous diversity, sometimes sexual orientation, but mostly gender identity and gender expression. So when you go there, you'll learn a little bit. I'm not going to read all of these. I'm just going to go through for representation. I'll let you do this on your own time. You can read about the Kalabai or Kalalai in Indonesia. And you can read about the Bakla in the Philippines. You can read about the Kathoe in Thailand. You can read about the Mukse or Mukse Zapotec, Oaxaca. You can read about the Lamana, the Zuni, and Wewa, this fascinating Zuni two-spirit leader. The Wintke in Lakota. You can read about Alhya and Huame among the Mojave. The Fa'afafine in Samoa. The Mahu in Hawaii, who are fighting their own colonial battles because our nation stole their islands. Stole as in theft. And Mark Zuckerberg is stolen about 1/3 of Kauai for himself, as if he deserves 1/3 of a whole island to himself. Whakaleita in Tonga. The sister girls or brother boys among the Aboriginal Australians. The Socrates in Madagascar. The Ashtime in Ethiopia. The 6 genders of classical Judaism. And recognize that for some religious traditions, like even Islam, which we equate a lot with Islamophobia and with homophobia, it's actually easier to be a transgender person theologically inside Islam than it is to be a gay or lesbian or bisexual person, because of the way that they're socialized in most Muslim countries. But there is a growing movement of folks in Islam that are LGBTQ. And that also brings up the question, why do we limit ourselves to 2 partners when most other family-making systems in the history of humanity have been poly, either polygyny or polyandry, right? Audre Lorde, who was intersectional before that term was invented, was a lesbian poet and academic, and she said there's no such thing as a single-issue struggle because we do not lead or live single-issue lives. She said people of color are expected to educate white people as to our humanity. Women are expected to educate men. Lesbians and gay men are expected to educate the heterosexual world. The oppressors maintain their position and evade their responsibility for their own actions. So you have to do your work on this. You need to do your own personal work. You need to do your work in your own faith traditions or life philosophy. There are groups in Buddhist circles that are doing some of this work as well. And this is why I think it's important for us to do it, because as we're recognizing, especially the attack on the trans community these days, gay and transgender workers lack comprehensive workplace protections in most states. We have better protections here in California than a lot of other places. Suicide among transgender youth is horrific, even in this county. You see the numbers, 41% responding, attempting suicide compared to 1.6 of the general percent of the general population. The rates were higher for those who lost a job due to bias, 55%, or where they were harassed or bullied in school, 51%, had low income, or were the victim of physical assault, 61%, or sexual assault, 64%. Trans women make 32% less than they did pre-transition. There's your proof of sexual discrimination right there, right? Going from a man to a woman in your public identity makes you 32% less post-transition. Even wider for trans women of color. Transgender men make approximately 1.5% more after transitioning than they did. Latino men, trans men, make 54 cents to the dollar. White transgender men make 79 cents to the dollar. This is where the discrimination hits the road, right? It's expensive to be poor, and it's expensive to be trans, and not just because your health care is more expensive. We're still trying to get gender-affirming care in this county. Every trans person that lives in Solano County has to go to Contra Costa or Alameda or San Francisco or San Mateo in Stanford to be able to get health care where the specialists are. It takes almost a full day if you're trying to take the ferry and the N-Line Judah all the way to UCSF for a 1-hour doctor's appointment. None of that's available in this county. When I talk to the people at Kaiser and ask them when it's going to change, none of them can tell me when. Even though there's a state law saying it needs to happen by next year. They have no plan yet about how they're going to do it. And, we've been tracking these anti-LGBTQ bills, like the ACLU is doing. That's from 2023. There were 506 of them. This last year, 750 plus. Groundbreaking study, anti-trans state laws increased suicide attempts by 72%, and research found that these bans lead to an increase, not just an increase in suicidal attempts among transgender individuals compared to states without such legislation. The survey surveyed over 61,000 trans and non-binary individuals through multiple waves of questions distributed by the Trevor Project, analyzed the state-level impact of anti-trans legislation. These bans, primarily targeting gender-affirming care, bathroom access, school policies, had not been examined using this methodology before, and the study's findings could have far-reaching international implications as more countries face pressure to implement similar restrictions on transgender care. If the Trump administration, in their negotiation with other countries, forces them to take similar views in order to have most favored nation status with us, we could see this happening not just here, but in many other states, pressured by our own government because of their own bias. And so how can you help? This is the most important thing. Having at least one accepting adult can reduce the risk of suicide attempt among LGBTQ young people by 40%. One. For the kids who don't have one accepting adult at school, or especially in their home, their suicidal ideation is 8.5 times higher. The rates of risky drug use is 3.5 times higher, and the rates of risky sex is 3.5 times higher. All they have to do is be loved by the people who said they would love them, especially their parents. That's the biggest help that we can give folks. And what we want is real change, right? Not just coins. We want societal change. We want our kids to survive. So this is how the work of the church can expand to all of the other things that we should be caring about, right? All of these things, compassion, diversity, loving God, asking for help, all of that matters. And if we can figure out a way to decrease this suicidal ideation and help our kids survive, we might actually be able to survive as a community long enough to be able to see and maybe walk back all of the policy change that we're afraid we're going to see over the next 2 to 4 years, right? So I offer a biblical self-defense class. This was last year's flyer, and Colin Amato, our clinical director, who's also an ordained minister in the Swedenborgian tradition, put together a workshop on addressing religious trauma with some great figures from recent studies that actually help us understand the role of religious trauma versus physical trauma, and both have very dastardly effects. But I'm willing to come and share the biblical self-defense class. Like I mentioned, I'll be doing it at St. Mark's Lutheran Sunday on just the Christian scripture portion. And really trying to address religious trauma is something that we take very seriously, especially because a lot of the conversations in this county are about 20 years behind the conversations even in Contra Costa County, because we don't have nearly as many open and affirming congregations that are public. So now imagine, how many times do you think a gay or a lesbian or a trans kid hears a negative message about who they are each day? And then I want you to think about how many times your congregation or you yourself need to try to make at least one statement a day to try to address that. How many messages will that teenager need to receive in order for them to know that they can survive and that they can thrive, even in a world that might be targeted against them? I think the church needs to do a lot more public love. And one of the guys that I've been seeing do it the best is David Hayward, the naked pastor. Have you seen him on Instagram? Look him up on Instagram. He's got some great little things like this one. But the verses, love over the verses. Oh, Lord, I just want more of your blessings. Oh, Lord, I just want to live. That's a trans flag. Whoa, 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 hold it right there. He wasn't lost. We kicked him out. I know, I found her. We might have to get creative in our resistance to help people recognize that they've been fed lies about who they should hate. What happened to him? He stood between me and the church. Whoever's running your social media for your congregation, they should have at least one pro-LGBTQ post each day, if not 9. Just to counteract the other 9 negative ones that the kids are hearing or seeing each day, right? They need to be seen, they need to be accepted, they need to be loved, because this is the image that you would want them to think of the church, that everyone is welcome under these loving arms of a compassionate Jesus. Every part of the flags, and yet that message is not getting through. Even if we're posting it, it's just not getting through. The algorithms are keeping it from actually showing up on the kids' phones. So you might have to do it 20 times a day so that it makes it through the algorithm, so that the kid sees it once. Bayard Rustin said, you have to join every other movement for the freedom of people. Because it's intersectional. That's what we know today, isn't it? Black liberation and Asian liberation is tied up with my liberation. I have to do as much work with them as I have to do for myself, or it's not going to make any difference. And as Bayard said, we need in every community a group of angelic troublemakers. So this is your mission if you choose to accept it. How will you be a creative resistor to the anti-compassion and anti-love that exists in our world and make a safe place for young people to be able to survive so that they can thrive. They have to survive first, just to give them a chance to thrive. So that's why we say this in UCC churches. No matter who you are or where you are on life's journey, you're welcome here, and it's because we've done enough cultural competency work ourselves. And trust me, there was a time when our Open and Affirming Coalition had to force churches to, in what was 2009, 2015, to add a statement for welcome of trans people to their congregational welcome statement. And thank God, most of the over 1,200 churches that are open and affirming in the United Church of Christ have done that. And they've gone through a process of teaching their own congregations enough about trans culture to be able to know how to welcome and fully embrace the whole alphabet soup within our group. And there's going to be new people that's going to be harder for us to love, and we're going to have to learn that all over again with whatever new group of our young people. And maybe it's poly, people that want to have a boyfriend and a girlfriend or two girlfriends. Maybe that's the cutting edge of the future. Who knows? Everybody that I talk to in theological circles thinks that who knows how that's going to look in the future. But if we don't do the work now to help them survive, they won't be able to thrive. So think what you can do to share and personal messages for the folks that you know to be able to keep people out of suicidal ideation, because that's the biggest thing that we see on a regular basis, even here in Solano County. A lot of hopelessness, even here in Solano County. All of these references are on the back sheet of your handout. You can trust these terminology definitions for a couple weeks. And then we'll go from there with whatever it looks like in the future. My contact information is on there. If you want to take a picture of this, we do have a confidential counseling message line. We have an MHSA or BHSA grant with the county that allows us to offer free counseling to anyone, straight or not. And so if you want marital counseling or just counseling that's going to keep you alive, we do that work. We have two great counselors. One's an LMFT and one's an ACSW social worker that also does some case management. We have youth programming. Go onto our website. All of our programming is there. It's working these days. This congregation's on the welcoming congregations list with about 9 others here in our county. That's all we have. For a population of just over 500,000 people, that's not enough. We used to have a UCC church in Amistad UCC up in Vacaville that closed years ago, right? So lots of work to do. And here are the next couple installments in this lecture series that I was very proud to be able to be included, to be a part of your conversation tonight. Thank you so much.
I want to personally thank Reverend Will for his for his words, and certainly invite you all to the next one in March. So as he talked